Welcome back. We've covered quite a bit of territory about what art is, some of its primary concerns, and the visual elements, those most fundamental building blocks of our visual experience. Today we'll talk about what happens when you put those components together in a work of art. And the first important bit of terminology here is composition. This is a broad term, and in the world of art, what it means is the way that the visual elements and design principles are arranged in a work of art, how these pieces are put together. Now, sometimes in three-dimensional work, this same concept is referred to as form. Form and composition are synonymous in that way, but form is a problematic word because it can mean so many different things that I prefer just to use the word composition. So what are these principles of design? What does that term refer to? Basically, it's how each of these visual elements that we've discussed are used in a composition. Things like how the use of shape can unify a picture by repeating a similar shape over and over again and give a sense of oneness to it, or by having variety where you have a whole lot of different kinds of shapes going on. That continuum of unity and variety is one design principle. Other ones include emphasis, where you direct your attention to, rhythm, there's this kind of predictable repetition, balance, in this case a balance of visual weight within a composition, and scale and proportion. All of these things steer the meaning of a work of art and are able to kind of push our buttons to manipulate what a viewer takes out of the experience of seeing the work. To what end? What is an artist trying to achieve by manipulating the visual components of an image? In what ways are they trying to affect the experience of the viewer? Keep in mind, as humans, we have a lot in common in the way our physiologies are wired. Artists have learned to exploit our shared universal tendencies of perception, like playing on the biological urges bestowed upon us by evolution. They say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that's oftentimes true. But a large part of what humans perceive as pleasant or unpleasant is wired in our biology and applies to every human being on the planet. Artists have also learned to take advantage of our cultural conditioning to hit just the right note for whatever subculture their message is playing to. This can happen formally, using strategic choices of color or rhythmic placement to make something aesthetically pleasurable to look at or listen to. Or it can happen conceptually, making design choices that convey your message in the most effective way possible based on your knowledge of how people process information. Obviously, the design principles have a built-in propensity for manipulation. This manipulation can be used for good, to reveal truth and beauty in the world, or to persuade people to believe in or act toward a good cause. But they could also be used for evil. Think about propaganda, think about advertising. Maybe if you're a marketing major, you would disagree with that bit, but selfish ends of the artist. A good citizen in a democracy learns to see critically as well as think critically. A good artist learns to use the principles of design effectively, hopefully in the service of the good. So first up is unity and variety. This applies to the harmony or disharmony between the parts in a composition. Humans are generally wired to desire a certain amount of unity, but at the same time, variety is the spice of life. In formal terms, this refers to the sameness or differentness in the use of visual elements. In aspects of content, this is accounting for interpretations of imagery. So, like if everyone in a scene is wearing a uniform, even if they're different jobs, etc., it still conveys ideas referenced by uniforms. And I think the balance between these two extremes of unity and variety is really the key. And depending on what you're trying to say, that might affect where exactly that balancing point is. But anything that's extremely unified is probably going to come across as boring, like a painting where it's all just one color, or beautiful and meditative. But in the extreme of variety is going to come across as like chaotic and haphazard and jumbled. Emphasis refers to the aspects of the design that draw a viewer's attention. This is primarily a content issue affecting the meaning that's conveyed by the artist. What's important in this picture that I want the viewer to really pay attention to? How do I move the viewer from one area in the picture to the next area? There are a lot of ways to dictate where the viewer's attention is directed. Through the use of line, our eyes naturally follow along lines that we see or the direction that something is pointing in. This can actively draw a viewer's gaze to a specific location in a picture and establish a sort of hierarchy of significance. Through shape, anytime you have a framed area, your eye naturally wants to go there. And if it's a frame within a frame, that's where your eye goes. Any contrasting element will draw attention. So will an object that's unlike everything in its surroundings, like a lone apple in a basket full of oranges. And where an object is located, it can draw attention as well. All things being equal, a person is likely to look near the middle of a composition first. Here's a well-known painting by Francisco de Goya, entitled The 3rd of May, 1808. The story behind this painting is compelling and relevant even in our contemporary world today. The story goes something like this. The French had, in a rather underhanded way, tricked Spain into allowing their troops to occupy their country and take it over in a sort of coup. The people of Madrid rose up against the French troops, and this painting depicts the subsequent French response, where Spanish protesters were rounded up and summarily executed en masse. Goya is an absolute master at using compositional choices to manipulate the message of his painting. Being Spanish, his point of view here is clear. He paints the Spanish protesters as the victims and the machine-like French soldiers as the villains. One could imagine the different way this event might have been presented by a French artist. One person's protester is another person's terrorist. But that's beside the point. Goya pulls out all the stops to draw our gaze to the moment of truth. You could check off the boxes one by one. Regarding line, you see this person's arms splayed out, arms and legs. There's sort of this X marks the spot kind of effect. Also, the guns are all pointing in that direction. Regarding shape, the hillside is framed by the night sky and the shadows on the ground. Inside that area is the central character of the story, the poor man, arms outstretched, pleading for mercy. How about contrast? The harsh contrast of light and dark in that character helps create the focal point. So does the splash of bright red color on the ground beneath him. Placement. When our eyes hit this painting near the center, they're immediately drawn to the doomed figure. There's little doubt about the message Goya is trying to get across, and his use of emphasis helps make that happen. Next is rhythm. This is simply elements in a composition that repeat themselves in a somewhat predictable way. This is inherently pleasurable for people. And artists, designers, and architects in particular have relied on this tool throughout history to make their work pleasurable to experience. Of course, it's a musician that we might first apply this design principle to. Like with a lot of the visual elements, there's a ton of crossover with our other senses. The analogy to sound helps clarify what visual rhythm is all about. It's really the same thing. In fact, this is often how we differentiate music, something that's positive, uplifting, could be profound, and noise, which can be as annoying as hell. It's the predictability, the way we anticipate what's coming next, like a steady beat versus cacophony. Obviously, this is a season to taste sort of thing. Some people like early Sonic Youth and its abstract, complex, biting sounds. Some people like straight-ahead pop music, where originality and unpredictability isn't necessarily valued so much. It's got a good beat and I can dance to it. Most people respond favorably to some balance between those extremes. Here are some examples of the use of visual rhythm. Notice the repetition in the lines of the drawing. They all sort of jaggedly scribble along and bulge up somewhere near the middle of the composition. Each line isn't the exact same, but they have a lot in common in that regard. The structure below involves a whole lot of slender poles extending from the ground to the ceiling. They're each different heights and colors, but the vertical rise happens across the entire facade. Look around the space you're in now. Architecture is obsessed with rhythm. In almost any structure, you'll find repeating shapes that tie the space together and create a sense of comfort or relaxation, or maybe surprise. Balance refers to the distribution of visual weight in a picture. What gives an area within a composition visual weight? Well, different things can create that sensation. The size of one object versus other objects. Like a picture of two trees, if one tree is really large on one side and the other tree is really small on the other, then the larger tree is going to have more visual weight. The contrast with the environment, an area of high contrast is going to have more visual weight than an area of like subtle changes. And of course the location of the picture plane as well. Something near the edge, kind of like with a seesaw. Something farther out on the edge of the composition is going to have more visual weight than something that's like closer to the center. You can think of this visual distribution in several ways. The most common way is thinking about like on the left side of the composition versus the right side of the composition, either side of the picture. What's going on one side versus what's going on the other. But also a top-bottom balance can play a really important role as well. Like, so for instance, a pyramid is a structure that's bottom heavy. The center to the edge could be another way of thinking about how visual weight is distributed, like in a circular composition or like a target. Each of these ways of distributing visual weight can influence the meaning of an artwork. But it's the left-right balance that's most likely being referred to by the term balance. And notice in both of these compositions here, the photograph of the Capitol building and then this Degas drawing, both of them have an equal distribution of visual weight from one side of the composition to the other. But they do so in different ways. The Capitol building is symmetrical. And so this photograph, taken at the angle it's taken from, it is a symmetrical composition as well. That's a pretty easy way of creating balance because like you've got a mirror image basically on one side compared to the other. But it could also be kind of boring. Usually symmetry is used to establish like authoritative kind of presence. So you see it in a lot of government buildings, you see it in a lot of churches. The one on the left, or sorry, the one on the right is the Degas drawing, employs asymmetrical balance, where you've got different objects, different shapes and colors on either side, but they balance each other out. They account for one another. So you've got the woman kind of leaning on the left-hand side, kind of crouching down and leaning towards the left. That puts a lot of visual weight on the left side of the composition. But then you have this really hard edge on the right-hand side, and then these objects stacked on the countertop, and the contrast there and the difference in the objects helps account for all the visual weight that's otherwise placed on the left-hand side. From a formal point of view, a balanced composition just looks right. Again, this is probably has to do with the way that we're wired as humans, like the way that our bodies crave a sense of equilibrium. Like if you walk into a room and you see a painting hanging on the wall, and it's like kind of crooked, something's going to feel wrong about it. You're going to want to have this urge to like straighten it out. It just looks right. Um, Conceptually, the principle of balance can reinforce ideas in a composition, which we kind of already talked about. You can imagine this that a top-heavy composition that feels really precarious versus one where a lot of the visual weight is near the bottom. It feels stable. And think of like the image of a pyramid. And then we also talked about establishing a sense of authority through symmetry. Um, these are different ways you can think about balance and different functions. Next is scale and proportion. Both of these have to do with size. When you're talking about scale, you're talking about size as an absolute. When you're talking about proportion, it's talking about size relative to other things. By manipulating scale and proportion in a composition, an artist can assign importance through hierarchy. Bigger is better. It can also be used to establish spatial relationships within a composition, like a sense of depth, this illusion of the picture being a window that a world opens up behind, as in linear perspective or foreshortening. And it can be used to create a sense of aesthetic pleasure, whether by conforming to specific cultural notions of beauty, or by playing on universal notions of beauty, as the ancient Greeks thought, which brings us to Pythagoras and the golden ratio. One of the issues we'll talk about when we get to the ancient Greeks is the way that they believed that there was this inherently pleasurable ratio that or set of proportions that everybody on Earth like kind of is plugged into to perceive aesthetic pleasure. And like I said, that'll be a fun topic for down the road a bit. But that's going to do it for today's discussion. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time when we move on from the formal concerns we've spent the last few lectures on and explore the content side of the coin and wrap up our exploration of the language of art.